The first inkling Miss Temperance Flowerdew had that her rather mundane day was about to turn anything but mundane happened when a closed carriage trundled up beside her, keeping pace with her every step as she walked down the sidewalk adjacent to Broadway. With her thoughts consumed by the watercolor lesson she was soon to teach at Miss Snook's School for the Education of the Feminine Mind, she gave the carriage only the most cursory of glances and continued forward. However, when the door to the carriage suddenly burst open, and a masked man bounded out of it, Temperance stopped dead in her tracks and turned her undivided attention to the scene unfolding directly in front of her. For the life of her, she couldn't comprehend why a member of what was obviously the criminal persuasion would behave in such a blatant fashion in the midst of a public sidewalk. Before she could come up with a reasonable explanation, though, the masked man set his sights on her, and then, to her utmost horror, he lurched her away and grabbed hold of her arm. The next thing she knew, she was hanging upside down over a very broad shoulder, the breath stolen from her lungs, right before she was tossed unceremoniously into the carriage. Wincing when she landed on a seat bereft of much cushioning, she managed to get a less than impressive "Help!" through her constricted throat. Scrambling for the door opposite of the one she'd been tossed through, her scrambling came to an abrupt stop when the masked man grabbed hold of her foot. He then kept a firm grip on that foot, even as he went about the tricky business of closing the carriage door while she twisted and turned in a desperate attempt to get free. The door shut with an ominous click, and darkness settled over the interior of the carriage, the lack of light adding a substantial amount of melodrama to what was already a very dramatic situation. As the carriage surged into motion, a burlap bag that smelled strongly of onions was pulled over her head, and something that felt quite like a very sharp knife pressed into her side.
"If you know what's good for you, you'll not make another peep,"
a voice rasped, as the carriage picked up speed, the driver evidently not having a care where he was driving, since Temperance could hear the yells of people trying to get out of the carriage's way. For the briefest of moments, Temperance was more than willing to abide to the demand of keeping silent. But when her scrambled thoughts began to settle, she realized that if she did remain quiet, she'd be spirited down Broadway with relatively few people aware of her troubling plight. There was little likelihood anyone who realized she'd been abducted would be able to follow her, since they'd all been on foot. With that in mind, she opened her mouth and managed to get what sounded exactly like a croak past her lips. Her croaking came to a rapid end when the bag was pulled off her head, and a cloth that smelled revoltingly sweet and was saturated with some type of liquid was pressed over her nose and mouth. Temperance's stomach immediately began to roil. Unable to dislodge the cloth, or the man, as the carriage continued to careen wildly down the street, she soon found her thoughts growing fuzzy and her limbs turning alarmingly numb. Before she knew it, her eyes fluttered shut, and everything faded straight away.
"I done told you, Eugene, that a person really can't be trusting those remedies sold at those apparition shops. Well, that lady has been senseless for hours. We ain't gonna get paid the rest of our money if we get to Chicago and discover she died along the way. Besides, I didn't sign up for no murdering of a young lady. That would go against everything Pastor Roy used to preach to us when we was young'uns."
Forcing her eyes open, even though they seemed less than willing to cooperate, Temperance blinked a few times, confusion coursing over her as her gaze settled on thin slices of light drifting through what looked to be small holes. A distinctive rumbling sound met her ears, but because her thoughts were incredibly muddled, she couldn't remember when she'd heard that rumbling before, or what it signified.